Ever worked on a Jira ticket that requires you to send some data to the server, and then you finish it up and you have to wait for like 1 week for the backend devs to finish up the endpoint so you can submit data to it and add stuff to the database? You have? Well, today we go over how to cut out backend devs out of the equation. And if you're a backend dev and you're pretty pissed at me and you're thinking, what about when I have the endpoint ready but the frontend devs take a week? Well, I'm just gonna show you what you've already been doing for years. Perfect, let's jump into it. So, as you might have guessed from the title, the topic of today's video is everything you need to know about Remix actions. So, first things first, what are actions and where do they operate? You probably already know this, but Remix uses modules, and one of the exports from these modules are actions. And what actions are your endpoints that you hit to update data, change it, do some sort of mutations, and then return a response. So what does this look like in practice? Imagine your component on the client, and then you have some sort of form on the client, and that form collects some data and then sends it to the server. Alright, and the server gets this data, and obviously you want to process it in some way, and in order to do that you want to use the data that was received from the form, make sure it's valid so that there was no tampering with it. For example, somebody changed it before it reached the server, or the user sent invalid data, then it would do some processing on the server, and once the server is done processing, it will, for example, call a database. The database itself would then store it and then send it back to the server. And then the server is like, okay, I'm done, I'm gonna respond to this annoying client of mine, and then it's gonna send the response back to the client. And then the client should do something with this, either show a toast message, show a notification, redirect you somewhere, and it's really up to you how you handle it. And this would be your usual kind of flow between the client and the server, and this right here would be your API call, and it would hit your server. The server would do something with the data, send it to the database would do something, and this API call is usually done by some sort of library like React Query or Axios or something like that. You would then hit your server, which was hosted somewhere, and this was usually not closely coupled with your client code, so front-end code, but this would maybe live in a separate repository where this was like a .NET backend or something like that. The .NET backend would have then some sort of architecture over it. We can go into this topic really deeply, but I'm not gonna go into it because you get that part, or I at least hope you do. So this would be your usual flow with regular applications, and the important thing is that when this responds to the client is responsible for handling it. So for example, the client would then say, hey, let me show a notification. For example, the data was submitted successfully, or you deleted your database entry successfully, or you deleted your user, whatever. And that's all fine and dandy. But then you would have to have callbacks once this is done. And the code kind of gets a little bit more complicated. And you maybe would have liked for the response to actually handle this part for you. And this is where actions come in Remix and how they work with loaders. So how does it work with Remix? Well, the flow is kind of the same. So what would happen is you would still have the client component, you would still have some sort of form, but the API call here is a bit different. So you use either use submit or use fetcher here. And you can also use the form component, but I'm pretty sure that the form component uses use submit under the hood to enhance it to work with JavaScript and falls back to the regular form component. And the cool thing about Remix is if you just have HTML here, so just a regular form, and you submit to an action, the form is gonna automatically work even if there's no JavaScript on the page. And this is what we call progressive enhancement. And it basically means, hey, I'm gonna enhance your forms to work with JavaScript, but in case you have no JavaScript loaded, I'm still gonna work. And this is a huge concept in Remix, and it's really easy to achieve this because of the nature of the components. And the use submit and use fetcher submit data to the server. So there are two ways for the server to handle the data. And I'm just gonna move the database a little bit. So in Remix, if the request made to the server is a GET request, a loader is gonna handle it. And if it's any sort of other requests, so post, delete, patch, whatever, so any other request, an action is gonna handle it. So this means instead of calling the database directly from the server and the database responding directly to the server, what is gonna happen is, because you're submitting to an action, so anything other than a GET request, you're gonna go and call the database from your action. The database is gonna respond to the action instead of the server, and then the action is gonna process this request and it's gonna respond to your server. Bam. And what is gonna happen here, because Remix got a response from an action, it's gonna say, okay, I'm going to re-trigger all the loaders that I have on the current route. So for example, if your route is user/1/edit, it's going to call the user loader, wildcard loader, so user ID or 1 in the case I just mentioned, and it's gonna call the edit loader. And all of these loaders are then gonna respond to your server, and then the server is gonna respond again to the client component. But the cool thing about this response is, if your loaders return some fresh data, it's going to respond to the client component and is automatically going to have the latest data in the response. So what this means is, if you mutate something on the server, let's say you have a user and he's changing his name, when he changes his name with the form, you're gonna submit that to the server. The server is gonna say, hey, you submitted a post request to the action. The action is gonna say, okay, I need to save the new name in the database. The database is gonna respond, the name has been changed. The action is gonna then respond to the server. And then when the Remix server figures out, hey, you just submitted to an action and it was successful, I'm gonna re-trigger all the loaders again, and then I'm gonna respond to the client component. And because you re-triggered all the loaders, and because the action is something that triggers before you re-trigger the loaders, the action itself can contain some sort of data like cookies or session or something like that. And what this would mean is, for example, let's say you want to show a toast notification and your loader returns this toast, but only if it's set in the cookie. What is gonna happen is the action is gonna store the cookie, and then once you make a GET request to the loader, it's gonna have the cookie, it's gonna pick up the toast from the cookie and set it to the client, and then the client is gonna say, hey, I just received a toast notification, I'm gonna show it. And that's the whole flow of actions. So what's important to know is, once the action triggers and finishes successfully, everything is re-triggered and the data is refreshed. And what this allows you to do is update a part of the UI in the action, and it's gonna be reflected across your whole application, because it's gonna re-trigger everything that's retrieved from the loaders, or rather it's gonna re-trigger loaders, and the newest data is gonna be sent to your client. So you have nothing to do after the action is fired successfully, because everything else is done by Remix automatically. You get the newest data on the client and you're done. So that's the high level overview of how actions work. Now there are some behaviors you need to be aware of. We're gonna go through them right now. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna do a little bit of editing magic and make this disappear. And I'm gonna go through some cases of what happens when you submit to an action. So the first case I wanna go through is the case when we return a response. So the usual flow is, you have your client component, you submit a post request to an action, and then the action successfully handles the request and sends back a response. So this is when you return data from the action. So this works all fine and dandy. And if you want to access your client component response data, you can use a special hook called useActionData. So the action is gonna send the data to this hook, and then this hook is gonna provide you with the data retrieved from the action. Alright, so that's when you return a response. And that's your 99% of cases scenario, where you just send the stuff to the action, it responds, and you're done. And the other scenario is when you throw a response or an error. The flow is pretty similar. you have your client component, it posts data to the action processes the data, but let's say in the action you try to validate if your user is authenticated. And if your user is not authenticated, you will throw a response. So there are two scenarios here that can happen. If you throw a redirect, it's going to redirect you to a new URL. So for example, let's assume that the URL from before was, for example, user1 update. So this was your old URL. So let's say you try to update the user and your session expired. It's gonna redirect you to the login page. And this will basically redirect you to a new page, fire the loaders on that page, and then render the login component. So basically it's gonna do loader and then new component. So that's the first scenario, and we just changed the colors for a bit of clarity. This is really useful if you have some sort of guards that prevent the user from doing something if the guard is not met. So for example, is logged in, is admin, is whatever, either authentication, authorization, and stuff like that. So that's the first thing you can do. So this is throwing a redirect, and what that would look like in code is basically throw redirect to login. So that's the first scenario. And the second scenario is, let's say you try to save something in your database and it breaks, or you try to save it and it's saved, and then you have some other condition that checks something, and that condition throws a response. So it doesn't throw a redirect response, but throws a regular response, for example, a 400 response. So both of those scenarios, so either throw response or error, are not gonna end up in the client component, but they are gonna end up in the error boundary. And the error boundary is gonna allow you to retrieve the error or the response that was thrown. But this is the usual flow that can happen. I've bundled these two together, so throwing responses and errors, because they end up in the same place and the flow is identical. This used to be different in older versions of Remix or React Router, where it had the error boundary and the catch boundary, but they have been merged ever since, so this is the same behavior, and I'm gonna focus on this one. And the last thing that's important to notice, throw redirect here is identical to throw response, but the only difference is in the status code. So both the throw redirect and the throw response throw a response, because what a redirect response is a response that redirects you, but what a regular response is just a normal response. So what the difference is that the redirect is gonna have the location header and the status is gonna be 312, so redirect, and the normal response is gonna be status 400. And those are the two subtle differences between redirect and response. So the only difference is in the status and the header location, and that lets Remix know, hey, you're not supposed to go into the error boundary, you're supposed to redirect to a new page. One last thing I wanna note here is that the useActionData here, the hook that I mentioned earlier, it stores the last action submission into it, and it's available through the whole app, which is really important if you want to create some sort of specialized hooks that rely on useActionData. So for example, if you heard about Remix.Toast implements a special suite of utilities called JSON with. And what this does is it basically returns, for example, a toast notification with a JSON response. And because of the fact that the useActionData hook is global and has the last submission, Remix.Toast uses that fact to basically check if the latest submission has the toast notification inside of it, and then renders the toast notification. Alright, that's it for this part. And one more thing I want to go over is, again with edit magic, let's imagine this scenario. You have a functionality to delete the user's profile image. And let's say you have three distinct ways of doing that. So for example, in the user's table, in the user's profile, and it's a shortcut that you can pull off through some drop-down menu. So you have three places in your application that do the same thing, but you have no idea how to do this without duplicating the code 3 times and writing the same action 3 times. So what you can leverage is something called resource routes. And you can imagine resource routes like API endpoints, and these are a special kind of routes in Remix that don't export a component. So what a resource route is, is, for example, if you have a normal route, the normal route has exports like loader, action, and the default component export. So this is a normal route, but a resource route can only have the loader and action exports and a few other ones, but those are not important for this part. And they do not have a default component export. So why these are called resource routes is because you can use them to either retrieve some data or mutate data on the server without having to return any UI. And why these are useful is because they act like API endpoints and they do not get sent to the client because they have no exports that are tied to the client. Why is this cool? So if we go back to the behavior I mentioned earlier, you can create a useFetcher hook that's going to call your resource route, handle the response, and this useFetcher hook can be used across multiple places in your app. So for example, if this route wants to delete your user image, it can just import the useFetcher and then use it to update the image without having to have the action export itself. Or if you want to do something completely different, let's say this action can either delete the user image via the useFetcher, or it can do something else with the action. So for example, update the username. So this action would update the username, and this useFetcher would call this resource route here and delete the user image. So that's a way you can do multiple actions in the same place. Or this action here can take multiple form submissions and do something different based on the intent. So either delete the image, update the name, or do some third thing. And these are the two options you have when it comes to doing the same thing in multiple places. And that's a really common pattern that you will see across Remix apps. So these are the two options you have and something you need to keep in mind. And that's it for the theoretical part. If you're sick of all my drawings, let's move over to StackBlitz and let me actually show you how all of these things work, so you can kind of gain some more appreciation for how simple Remix is. And I'm gonna snap my fingers like Thanos. Alright, welcome back. So let's set everything up. I've added Remix DevTools so we can see what's going on. I'm gonna add a loader to the root, and I'm gonna return null for now, and I'm gonna console log root loader, and as we can see it's logged here. And I'm gonna copy this, I'm gonna go into my index, I'm gonna paste it here, I'm gonna say index loader, and we have our playground more or less ready. So if I refresh this, we will see the root loader and the index loader. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you is how do actions work, but in practice. So if I export a const action and I console log action here, let's add our first form, and I'm gonna import this form from Remix.run/React, and I'm gonna save it, and we have a invisible form, and we need to add the following. So the method is gonna be post, and the action is gonna be here, and I'm gonna add a button here, submit. If you don't already know this, every button without a type is by default a submit button. So if I click this, it's gonna already submit the form. But because by default Remix submits to the current action on this page, we can even remove this action and save this. So if I click submit, you can see that the action was triggered here, and the log in the action, so this one, was also triggered. And then you can see that the root loader was triggered and the index loader was triggered. So this was what I was talking about earlier when I said when you submit to an action, it is going to retrigger all the loaders on the page, and indeed it did. So this is the first thing you need to know. So the second thing is, let's say we have an input here, it's of type text, or actually let's say email, and the name of it is gonna be email, and we're gonna do another one. So instead of email, we're gonna do text, and we're gonna do password. And now let's look at magic thing here. Let's try to submit email@email.com, and the password is password. So this would be your typical login screen, and I'm gonna click submit. And as you can see, all the same logs have been triggered. So the cool thing about this is if I do this and I say action function arguments and I say request and then I say form data is equal to request dot form data, I need to make this async to await this. And now that I have it, we're gonna say email is equal to form data dot get email and password is equal to form data dot get password, and we're gonna console log email and password, and I'm gonna save this. So let's try to submit this again. Submit, and as you can see, we got our email and password. So this is all with JavaScript. It's working. We get our email and password, we retrieve it from the form data, and let's say you're in an airplane, the Wi-Fi is great, and you have no JavaScript. So I'm gonna delete these scripts here, and this scripts basically loads up the JavaScript. So at the moment we have no JavaScript on the page, and if I go back here and I click submit, well, would you look at that, we still got our email and password and it works fully without JavaScript. So this is the really cool and neat part about Remix, because it relies on the web standards, and this is just a post request with the form data to the server. This is how the browser behaves without JavaScript anyways, and this form is progressively enhanced, which means it works without JavaScript, but it's enhanced in a way to work with it as well, so you can add additional validation and stuff, but you're just submitting a plain and normal form to an action, and this is why it works. So if I bring back the scripts here and save it, and then I submit again, it's still gonna work. And that's the really neat part about Remix. It works with and without JavaScript. Now, this doesn't mean it's really easy to do everything without JavaScript, and there are many packages out there for form handling that allow you to handle progressive enhancement like conform or remix hook form, but in essence this is how they work behind the scenes. They just enhance these things with some different stuff, like they add default values to inputs and stuff like that, but that's not important for now because we are not gonna go into form handling deeply right now. I have another video on the channel that you can watch on that topic and how that works, but the important takeaway here is how Remix handles forms and how actions take part in the whole process. Alright, now that we have that covered, another thing you can do is on the button you can say intent and you can say the value is create, and I'm gonna click submit, and here we're gonna say intent form data get intent, and we're gonna console log that as well. So if I submit the data now, you can see that the intent is create. And if I add another button and I say update and then I click update, the intent is gonna be update. So why is this useful? So for example, let's say you're creating a new user in the database. What you can do is you can say if the intent, or rather switch on the intent. So the case where the intent is update, you're gonna do update user in the database. And when the case is create, you're gonna create the user in the database. And by default, I don't know, you can, let's say you don't expect to end up here, you can throw a new error, not supported, or you can handle it however you want. After this is done, we're still gonna return null here. And I'm gonna save this. And this is one of the ways to handle branching forms on a single page. So for example, if we had multiple forms here and all of them did different things, you could just fetch the intent from the form data, and let's say in the create you're gonna fetch the email and the password, and here you're just gonna fetch the email, for example, and then in the update you're gonna say console log email updated with the email. Or let me show you this. So let's say return message email updated, and in here we're gonna say return message email, or rather user created. So this is a really simple example, but now what the cool thing is if we do const action data, or whatever you like to call it, use action data, and then we import this from remix.run/react and we save it. And what I can do is I can do p, and I'm gonna do action data, and I'm gonna type this with the type of action data dot message. And I'm gonna do this, and let's try this again. So email@email.com, password, submit, user created. And if I do update, and if I change this to actually be update and save it, so submit, user created, update, email updated. And this is how you can handle this. There are many other ways, but this is in essence how you can do it. So this doesn't even have to be in a same form. It even could be something like, so you would have email, password, and submit, and I'm gonna change this to create. And then you can have another form, and this is only email with the intent of update. And now what we can do is we can say email@email.com, update, email updated, and then we submit this, user created. And because we have no validation, you can even do this without filling the inputs. But if I, for example, add the required here and save it, and if I delete the email, it's gonna complain. And that's how you can handle multiple forms on the same page. So there's another way to handle multiple forms on the same page, or rather actions, and that is creating resource routes. So let's create one right now, and I'm gonna show you a cool little trick I usually use to submit to those actions. So let's say resource.user.update.ts. So this is gonna be a TS file, because we're not gonna export the component, so we don't need TSX. And I'm gonna do export const action async, and I'm gonna import action function arguments from Remix.run node. I'm gonna type this, I'm gonna say request, I'm gonna say return null. Now it works again. So let me show you a trick on how you can submit to this resource route. So for example, let's export a const called useActionData user fetcher, and what we're gonna do inside of here is we're gonna say const fetcher is equal to use fetcher, and the fetcher is gonna come from remix.run/react. And the first thing we're gonna say is the key is going to be resource.user.update. You don't have to specify the key. I just like to specify them for the resource route updaters, so you can submit multiple fetcher requests to the same route. If you want to submit, you can remove the key. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna return the fetcher. So this fetcher has a submit function, as you can see. So what we're gonna say is, because we're returning the fetcher, we're gonna say fetcher submit, and let's say user data, and this is gonna be an object that takes the name, so for example string. It's really up to you how you type this, and this is gonna call the fetcher.submit with the user data. And in the options, we're gonna say action is resource/user/update. So this is the URL of the action, and then the method is gonna be a post request. And we're gonna save this. So what this is gonna do is gonna submit the user data to this action, and then we're gonna get the form data, and then we're gonna do name is equal to form data dot get name. And inside of the fetcher submit here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a form data object, or add a new form data. We're gonna submit the name, so form data set is, so the name is gonna be user data dot name. And then instead of submit the user data, we're gonna submit the form data, and we're gonna save this. And now that we've saved this, we're gonna use update user fetcher, and we're gonna use it here. So fetcher is equal to use update user fetcher. We're gonna import this, so import from resource.user.update, and save this. And then we're gonna refresh this, and now the page works again. So what we can do now is, for example, let's say on click. Now there are a million ways to do this, but I just want to show you one of the ways that you could. So fetcher submit. So now this is fully typed, and we need to pass a name, so hello. Oh, and this needs to be string like this. And then what we can do is we can add another button. So for example, button here, and we're gonna say type is button, update user button, and on click. And then when I say this, you can see that the action routes resource user update was triggered. And let me console log the name here. So if I do it again, we can see that the name is hello. And this again is one of many ways to use a resource route to update your database, do some custom stuff. So we have this testing route, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna say here const data is equal to use loader data, type of loader. We're gonna import this from remix.run/react. We're gonna save it. We're gonna say data.a and save this as well. What we're gonna do on this page is, let's say we wanted to first authenticate the user. So let's say we have, for now I'm gonna do is authenticated is equal to true. If the user is not authenticated, we want to throw redirect to testing. And how we're gonna do this, and I'm gonna import this as well from node. Let's say we have a guard here that makes sure that our user is authenticated, and if he's not, we're gonna throw a redirect. And now if I submit this, because this is true, nothing is gonna happen. As you can see, I go through the action. But if I set this to false, so let's say the user isn't authenticated and I click update, we are redirected to the testing page. And as you can see, if we look at this response here that's rendered here, it's 1. So if I do, this is the testing page, we have successfully redirected our user to a new page. So like I said, if you throw a redirect, it redirects the user to a new page. But if I go back here, I set this to true, and then I go back to here. So check this out. First, I'm gonna add export const error boundary. I'm gonna return a div. Hey, you just killed me. So instead of throwing a redirect in the action, let's throw a new response. And I'm gonna do null here. So what's gonna happen now? If I click update, oh, and I need to do false here. If I click update, hey, you just killed me. So what's going on? If you look at the logs here, it says that it threw a response and it responded with a status of 200. So even if it's a 200, it's gonna go into the error boundary. And I think this is gonna change in the future of Remix, where if you return a 400, it's gonna go into the error boundary, but 200 is gonna go back as a normal response. Because if you want to validate data on the server and you figure out, hey, for example, this email already exists in a database, you want to throw a response with a 200, and then the user gets the action data in the component, and you can update the form instead of actually going into the error boundary, then saving the data from the form and doing some shenanigans. So inside of the error boundary, if you throw a response that's not a redirect, it's gonna go into the error boundary. Or if we throw a new error here, and then I save this, and then I click update again, and I'm gonna do died, and we just threw an error, and we ended up in the error boundary here. And again, we get the hey, you just killed me. So if you throw an error or a response, you end up in the error boundary. And the final tip for today, let's say you want to log the user in and then redirect him to a new page. So how you can do that is, instead of returning a message here, you actually again return a redirect. So for example, dashboard, or let's do testing because dashboard doesn't exist. And if I click update, it sends me to the testing page. So those are all the ways you can use actions. Now I went through resource route actions, I went through normal actions, I went through intent and how you can do different stuff with different intent. And this is everything you need to get started. Now there are advanced things you can do, like adding middleware in between this. And when I say middleware, I don't mean Remix middleware because that's not out yet, but like custom middleware. So let's say you want to have the route authenticated. So you could create something like authenticated, which would be a carried function, and you would take args as action function args, and it goes into here, and then the function I'm gonna do any here just to show you what I mean. So for example, you would have your authentication logic here, and then you would call the function with args and return this. And then for example, you can just do something like this, and this would authenticate and then call and return your function. So what this would do, if I console log authenticated, and if I go back to the page and then click update, you can see that it went into the authenticated, and then it went to the action, and then it responded. So that's another cool thing you could do. I mean, you would have to create the types here, and it's a little bit cumbersome and not easy to do, so I don't really recommend doing this, but you can. There will be Remix middleware as a first class support really soon, so you can use that as well. And this works better with resource routes. For example, if you want to create a third-party API that you can integrate with other platforms, or rather they can integrate with you, you could add like authenticated server loggers, blah blah blah, and just by the time you reach this action, you have done everything you need to do. And that's pretty much it. This is the third installment in the Everything You Need to Know About series. I really hope you like it. It's been a blast creating these, and the support has been overwhelming. I'd really like to thank everybody for watching and supporting me. If you like the video, like it. If you want to share it with others, feel free to do so. Feel free to follow me on social media as well. I have Twitter, I'm active there. I maintain a lot of open source, so if you're interested in that as well, you can see my GitHub profile. And that's it for this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye!